And we're live. Take it away, John.
Good afternoon and Happy New Year. I hope that everyone is returning back to their offices and back to the work, refreshed and renewed for all of the work that we have ahead. Here at the Schott Foundation for Public Education, we want to thank you for joining the continuation of our 25th anniversary webinar series that is focused on addressing some of the issues that help create the conditions to provide healthier living and learning communities and to provide all students an opportunity to learn. Through this webinar series, we've had the opportunity to address issues around implicit bias, testing, and today's topic is just as critical. How do we deconstruct the school to prison pipeline for girls of color? I'm very excited about this conversation because it is a conversation that needs to happen more, and it's a conversation that our moderator and our panelists have been at the forefront in pushing the issue and getting communities and policymakers and others to address the issue. The Schott Foundation for over a decade has identified the issue around gender equity as being critical to providing all students an opportunity to learn. And this effort today and the effort that we will continue throughout the year is a part of continuing that legacy. To help us through this conversation, we have an outstanding moderator today, one that I'm glad to be able to call a friend, but also she is a member of the Schott Foundation Board of Directors. Many of you, however, know her because of her work as co-founder and director of Cadre, a grassroots parent organizing group in Los Angeles. So with no further ado, please allow me to turn over this session to Macy Chen. Macy?
Good afternoon and good morning to everybody. Happy New Year as well. Thank you, John. And I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. We have a lot of folks joining us, which is thrilling. And we certainly want to make the most of our time together. So I want to kick this off by really grounding us in the context for this webinar. We've heard school to prison pipeline, bandied about for a number of years now, and certainly many of us who are in the work of trying to dismantle the school to prison pipeline have certainly been at it for many, many years. And over the past year or two, there have been a lot of accountability calls to really make sure that we're not invisibilizing girls in this work, and Black girls in particular. So let's just really take stock of the fact that Black girls and other girls of color are disproportionately experiencing harsher school climates and discipline than most of their peers. The most recent data released by the U.S. Department of Ed has Black girls being suspended 6 times more often than their white peers. These punitive approaches to conflict often push Black girls out into the juvenile justice system. And whether it's school or it's confinement, the conditions the consequences of Pushout rather, really can be lifelong conditions that are difficult to overcome. So as all this work has really gained traction, we're constantly not just trying to find data that proves that it's a problem, but also tapping into the wisdom of many, many advocates, policymakers, organizers, educators, researchers who can really advance solutions. So for both policy and in practice, where the rubber really meets the road, and where we have to impact girls' lives to disrupt this pipeline. But most importantly, we have to create another set of conditions. And so today we're going to be exploring the important work in this area. And we're really going to focus on the promising solutions that have come out of the work of Dr. Monique Morris and her colleague Aishatu Yusuf. And while all their bios can be found on our website, we want to make sure that you know a little bit about them all. Dr. Morris is an author and social justice scholar. Her most recent book is Pushout, the Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools. Her research intersects race, gender, education, and justice to explore the ways in which Black communities and other communities of color are uniquely affected by social policies. In addition, she's an adjunct professor at St. Mary's College of California, and just as importantly, she's a co-founder and president of the National Black Women's Justice Institute. Aishatu Yusuf has also worked with Dr. Morris, and she's experienced in federal, state, and local government program development, conducting projects, social science research, evaluation, and policy analysis, really focusing on addressing issues that permeate the juvenile and criminal legal system. Aishatu is currently working on participatory research that is focused on addressing the school to confinement pathways for girls. So that's a little bit about our presenters today. Before I pivot to them, I want to remind everyone to use your chat feature to pose questions. We have someone who will standing by and checking out both the chat box as well as Twitter. So you can use the Twitter handle at the Schott Foundation. It's at Schott Found, which is @SchottFound, and then use the hashtag grassrootsed. And then, of course, if you're, you can use the group chat box as well. So hashtag grassrootsed @SchottFound. Okay, let's get this party started. It's my honor today to moderate this again, and I want to welcome Dr. Morris and Aishatu. Your book, Pushout, Dr. Morris, came out last year, and during a period in which all of us working in the school to prison pipeline were being called into account for rendering invisible girls, especially Black girls, from our framing, our analysis, our strategies, and using the false dichotomy of gender competition to sort of gain traction on this issue. And that accountability call should never, ever end. And you obviously had the foresight to ensure that wouldn't happen. And thankfully, we at the Schott Foundation have listened to our partners doing girls' work for nearly a decade, as John mentioned. So your book enriched our view of the horizon and what it's going to mean to not just end, but to reconstruct safety and justice for Black girls. And so you're focusing and transforming your research into policy and practice is extremely exciting. And the design thinking, the political courage, and the patience needed to do this reconstruction, I'm sure holds practical insights for all of us. So I welcome you, Dr. Morris, to share what you and Aishatu, your colleagues, and most importantly, the girls you work with have learned. So, thank you.
Thank you. I really want to send a note of thanks to the Schott Foundation and everyone who is in conversation with us today regarding this issue. I want to acknowledge that there has been a growing and increasingly present learning community that's been focused on how to engage girls and young women in this conversation. And so I recognize that in many spaces, you know, there's the tendency to make this about one book or a single articulation of this issue. But in fact, I really just recognize that there's a full community of people who have been learning with us, working with us, and building with us. Schott being among those who have been a part of this conversation for a while. So I'm very pleased to share our sort of next iteration of this work and to recognize that what Aishatu and I are going to share today is really, you know, a conversation that is developing in our workspace that has policy implications, and certainly we hope programmatic implications as we talk about what it is that we've been doing for the past year in response to this very critical issue. I want to start by just acknowledging that a couple of things. One is that for those who have heard me talk about this issue or who have read some of my work, recognize that I don't tend to use the framework around school to prison pipeline, but more school to confinement pathways. And I do that intentionally to recognize the policies, practices, and conditions, as you were highlighting, but also the prevailing consciousness that facilitates criminalization among our girls and young women, the relationships that lead them into contact with the juvenile legal system, the relationships that are absent in many of their spaces of learning that can facilitate them being pushed away from school, turned away from school, or removed from the classroom or learning space. And so when we do that, when we attack the prevailing consciousness that has been guiding both the policy making, but also the interactions with young people, I think it provides for us an opportunity to think about disproportionality a little bit differently, and also what feeds the disproportionate rates of contact that we see with Black girls in particular, but also with other girls who are impacted by punitive responses to negative student behavior. Certainly, as we were talking about, or as we've been doing this work, we have recognized the racial disparities that are more prevalent among girls than we even see among boys with respect to how they are experiencing school discipline, where Black girls are the only group of girls who are disproportionately represented along the entire continuum of punishment in schools. We certainly recognize that there are opportunities for girls, particularly Latinas and Indigenous girls, who are also experiencing disproportionate rates of contact, which is why this conversation and our work in building out responses has really engaged and centered what does it mean to have a culturally competent and gender responsive space for girls of color who are experiencing multiple oppressions, transgenerational trauma, historical trauma, which is the bigger issue that we fail to engage critically in our work, and in some ways feels so big that we may not feel that we have the capacity to examine, but I think otherwise. But certainly, it's come into our practice and our research, both in terms of a project that we have, NBWJI has in partnership with the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, that's looking at school resource officers and girls of color, and also in a pilot educational reentry program that we have for girls in the Bay Area in California that has been doing a series of programmatic work in partnership with several partners. And that's what I kind of want to talk most about today, are some of the preliminary observations that are coming out of that work and some of our thoughts with respect to how we begin to interrupt the school to confinement pathways, and not just to interrupt them, but to really build out confinement to college pathways, college and career pathways, so that we begin to challenge ourselves to think differently about what our children are capable of and what the narrative is for our young women, particularly our young women who are living and experiencing school on the margins. At the end of Pushout, I outlined what I thought were important components to generating responsive learning environments for girls, for Black girls in particular. But much of what I put forward is applicable to all marginalized girls in learning spaces. And those included the implementation of alternatives to exclusionary discipline, the development of a more robust continuum of gender responsive programming and interventions for girls, that recognizes the need for healing informed responses to negative student behavior, that recognizes that in order for us to have healing informed classrooms, we need to co-construct that environment with our young women and engage them in processes of responding to some of the issues that they are uniquely experiencing with respect to misunderstandings and mischaracterizations of their identities, but also their own affirmation and articulation of learning as a function of social justice and as their practice, everyday practice of social justice. Creating the college and career pathways that include some alternative ways of learning and recognition that kids learn in different ways, and also responding to their learning space and creating de-biased learning spaces that is really one that reflects more of an empathic mindset among educators and those who are working in schools, rather than a punitive mindset among those who are working in schools. And so we took these basic tenets and partnered with an organization here in the Bay Area called the Mentoring Center, who has been a critical institutional partner for us in the development of this pilot educational reentry program for girls. And we structured it as a reentry program largely because we wanted to work with girls who had already experienced school pushout. So we went directly to those girls who have already experienced multiple suspensions, have already been experiencing multiple expulsions, have evidence of experiencing, again, as I was saying earlier, transgenerational trauma, who are experiencing discrimination and bias at the intersections of their identities, and wanted to work with them around constructing new ways of learning, new spaces for being and healing, and really visualizing and trying to develop school as a location for healing. And that's a departure from what they have experienced in the past, and also the ways in which we frame education. We tend to think about education as a place where kids are learning critical tools to advance their participation as citizens in this country, rather than thinking about schools as locations for healing from transgenerational historical trauma, and also thinking about schools as places that can help girls navigate the tools and instruments that they have in them naturally to really understand and grow as full human beings. And so in our work in developing Emerge, we call it Emerge, and Emerge stands for educating, mentoring, empowering, and reaffirming our girls for excellence. And so, you know, from the very inception, we're thinking about ways of revising the narrative about girls who have experienced school pushout and engaging them as critical partners in constructing what they need to be successful and how they can repair their relationships with schools. Our critical educational partner in this initiative is Alameda County's Office of Education, and they provide for us they're the teacher of record, essentially, the instructors of record who come in and work with our girls through independent study. And we have a series of, we have a number of counselors and therapists who work with, and I'll walk through the structure in a moment. But I want to share that we recently released and will be releasing a series of working papers that help us construct really what we're learning along the way, recognizing that, again, we are part of a learning community that wants to use the real-time input of our girls in response to this critical issues, such that it's not just about creating and generating research that can sit on a shelf, but really that can help us provide and develop tangible responses to this critical issue in real time as our girls are seeking to reconnect with schools, as we are engaging in conversations about how to build out a confinement to college pathway for our girls. So our structure is to have about 15 to 20 girls. We have a program director, a lead teacher, and what we call a learning mentor. We've had for the past year a single learning mentor, but one of the things that we have found as a critical component to developing gender responsive programming for girls and also really reconnecting and rebuilding their relationships with school is the need to have not just one learning mentor, but two learning mentors. And this learning mentor is a critical piece of our reimagination of how to facilitate healing in the classroom, because this person's function is really to establish and build relationships between the girls and the multiple systems with which they're engaged and in connection. And so often we think about girls who are in high crisis situations or conditions as being girls who we can't really do much with. We label them as troublemakers. We kind of say they have a lot of issues going on, but that's outside of what we can do in our learning spaces. For us, it's a bit different. We wanted to think about this position in creating school as a location for healing by creating a position in the classroom that follows that girl and helps her navigate her relationships with the court systems, with the child welfare system, if that's what she's engaged with. Again, I was saying a number of our girls are girls who have had contact with the juvenile legal system, and so a number of our girls are experiencing homelessness and extreme forms of poverty. And so we need a person in the classroom who also then serves as a liaison between these girls and their educators. And so this person is sort of functioning and moving with the girls and providing the kind of necessary support that she needs in order to be more fully present in her learning space. We have learned that we need not one of those functions in the classroom, but actually two. One that is moving outside of the school and in the school, and one that is just located in the school. Because many of our girls in this process of repairing their relationships with schools, have not had the kinds of relationships that we know to be critically important for their learning in the classroom. And so we need someone who is in the classroom with them, who can also work with them around building those relationships inside of that single institution, as well as navigating their relationships with the external institutions. We also have, through our partnership with our local Office of Education, again, an independent studies teacher who has experience working with girls who are returning to community from multiple suspensions, expulsions, and contact with the juvenile legal system, who has been working with us to grant credits to girls who who are in desperate need of recovering credits upon their interactions with the courts and with other deeply problematic conditions. And having a teacher who understands that these girls are coming from conditions of extreme victimization has been very important to, again, developing the empathic mindset that we see as a core function of how we begin to repair relationships with schools and with each other, the girls with each other and those in their communities. And so as we continue to think about, some of the preliminary observations, some of which are outlined in the working paper, and that I think you'll see continue as we talk about what it is that we need to put in place for our girls, the structural components, as well as the new framework around what it means to co-construct a safe space and trauma-informed, healing-informed climate for learning, is that establishing trust is probably one of the most important aspects of facilitating a learning environment where girls are most responsive to their teacher. Relationships are everything, in other words. And the leadership and activities that connect learning to real world role modeling and creating demonstration projects are key, but that ultimately, when we're talking about the development of the empathic relationships between teachers, educators, and others who come into the classroom as consultants, who come in as workshop facilitators around restorative practices, or who come in around dance or boxing, which are other activities that we've offered to our girls, that much of the process of reclaiming their own bodies, much of the process of reclaiming their own spirit and engagement such that they feel ready and prepared to learn, begins with the relationships around and the trust that we are building with our girls. And maintaining these partnerships is key. So are you trying to say something? I see you, Maisie, saying something, and I wasn't sure if you wanted to say something. Okay. So these are some of the critical pieces that we've been learning programmatically. And I think, what's most exciting about this work and about the opportunity to share this with everyone is that these are things that are not necessarily reliant on new funding. That part of what we're finding is that while we're talking about the need to engage in a more robust investment in our girls, a lot of what we need to do is challenge our own thinking and engage in an examination around this consciousness that really has facilitated punitive responses to girls for who they are, not necessarily for or in recognition of the conditions that they are emerging from. And so when we engage in this as an appreciative practice, so when we center in them their unconditional positive reactions to their own conditions, or invest in our girls to uplift the things that have been most responsible for their resilience, that's when we see that we can tap into something greater. And when we have educators and partners and others who are coming into the classroom who uplift those qualities in our girls, that's when we see that they are most responsive to them as adults, as caring adults. In all of the conversations that I have had and that we have been having with girls, not just in the Bay Area, but across the country, in addition to them, sort of laying out the host of things that get them in trouble in schools, they also lay out a series of things that they wish were in place in schools. And so what we've been trying to do is implement those strategically into our practice in the classroom, but also in terms of how I and Aishatu present this information to others so that we can learn together and think about this critically. Because often what happens when girls get in trouble is we feel that we only have a single modality at our disposal around healing, and that's the restorative circle. And if girls are not prepared to engage in the circle conversation, then we tend to think that they are not ready to repair their relationships, or we tend to think that they are not prepared to actually engage in any healing process. And we have found, or we're finding and learning, that that's just not true. That there are multiple ways in which our girls are able to heal and repair, and that oftentimes we assume that girls are in a space prior to their engagement or being called into engagement around a circle practice or a restorative conversation, that they're ready for that. And so, you know, often what we're finding is with girls who have experienced transgenerational traumas, who have internalized oppression to such a degree that they can't sit in circle with someone who they felt has caused harm, that a lot of that is because they have not done the individual work yet that can help them center their responses and really be engaged in understanding why it's important for them to repair these relationships. And so we have had situations where girls are in conflict with each other in very real ways, and we have not relied on suspensions and expulsions to move them out of the classroom. Instead, we have relied on the relationships that we spent months developing with the girls to get them to understand how they have caused the harm, and to have conversations with their family, with their parents, with their surrogates, with their loved adults in community, to respond to them in their moment of crisis. And in that way, we've been able to think differently about how we want to see them engaged, but also how they see themselves as being able to engage in this work. You know, early on in our development of this pilot, and also early on in conversations with girls, we found that because the conversation had been so squarely focused on boys, that many of the girls were not even able to see themselves as a part of the conversation. That when we asked them about what they needed to succeed or the kinds of conditions they needed in the classroom, they tended to articulate the things that would greatly benefit the boys, and they would ignore things that were critical to their own development around creating safe spaces for them as individuals, attacking the sexual harassment that girls routinely experience in schools, the ways in which dress codes disproportionately impact their lives, that with time, getting them to see themselves was a critical part of how we co-construct a community of safety. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do with this work is to demonstrate that even our girls who are most at risk of school pushout, who have experienced the multiple suspensions, expulsions, et cetera, that when we get them to see themselves as whole people, when we get them to articulate and recognize their important contributions to the learning space, that's when we're able to generate new frameworks around safety. And so, you know, this has informed not just our practice in the classroom, but also our approach to really mapping the policies that are facilitating criminalization in other ways, and also the kinds of questions that we might ask ourselves as educators, as education advocates, as you know, folks who are organizing in communities around these issues. So I kind of want to pivot to Aishatu and invite her to share some of the work that we've been doing to map some of these conversations and some of the policy directions before I continue with some of our other learnings.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. And Monique, thank you for sharing such powerful information. So I am going to pivot just a little bit, and I'm only pivoting a little bit because I want to talk a little bit more broadly about some of this work that we're doing. As a national organization, we look at projects like Emerge and like our project with this school resource officers. And we also look at how are policies impacting the girls we're talking about? How are our broader policies, federal, state, local policies actually working to help or hinder what it is we're talking about? And how is it that we get teachers, advocates, and folks like you that are all on this call to really be involved in the policy implication of this? And so I'm going to talk about that actually quite briefly, because I do want to get back and make sure we have enough time for questions and things like that. So one of the things that we think about in mapping some of these policies is what's relevant right now. And so as most of you, a lot of you on here are educators, we're thinking about what's happening with ESSA. You know, we think about how is that going to impact, right now they're saying it's talking about assessments in schools. What does that have to do with girls? What does it have to do with gender? And the reality is a lot. And what we need to think about is how is that policy going to impact our girls in these situations? So we think about the reauthorization of ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. I apologize for using an acronym. And it's the idea of like, how do we get our administration, how do we get our states, how do we get people to talk about what we need, especially in relation to girls? And so one of the ways in which we think about that is thinking about, so just a quick synopsis, in the ESSA Act, every state basically has to have 5 indicators of assessment. 5 indicators of assessment, variety of indicators. One of those indicators, however, they get to choose, and it's not federally mandated, and that is around school climate and inclusion. And that is one of the big ways in which we can think about what does this look like for our girls, and what is it, how do we use this one indicator to really impact our girls? And one of the ways we think about that is how do we push our educators to really look at school discipline, really look at trauma-informed services in our schools? How do we get them to actually look at the data disaggregated with girls? You know, things that we're looking at, the things that matter for this subgroup of a population. As Monique stated, so much of discipline and so much of Pushout has been around boys. And kind of like a general idea, and how is it that we get actually our government, our state governments, to actually look at the subgroup of girls and pull out the data and pull out what's actually happening, looking at more than looking at restorative practices, but how do we actually use that in our schools, and how do we get them to use a policy like ESSA and a state plan they have to do to actually look at that, looking at how it is that teachers are trained, what are the trains that the teachers get, and also thinking about, you know, how it is that we use that information to push our administration and push our states and push our federal governments. And I'm going to probably talk about that a little bit more, but one of the other ideas of policy that I did want to talk about as well, and one of the big things that we're mapping right now is really looking, and I hope, Monique, I don't know if you're talking about this later, so I'll hope to keep it brief, is really looking at disrupting school policies around our state. Around our states. So there was an article that came out in the Atlantic a few months ago that really talked about what happened in South Carolina, and I don't want to get into that because I just think that many of us are aware of what happened in South Carolina with regarding school resource officers and the treatment of the young lady in school. But what came from that is thinking about why was it okay for her? Why did folks think it was okay for a resource officer to be in there, and why was it okay that she even had something that they could criminalize her for? And part of the reason was because we have this idea of disturbing schools, policies, and laws. And those look different in other states, but there's about 22 states and actually more cities than that actually have what we call disturbing schools laws. And one of those, and so in South Carolina, what that looked like is annoying behavior, and how we criminalize girls for annoying behavior or loud behavior or boisterous behavior. So these words, I'm giving you some of the words they use, but they use this kind of in a variety of ways in different states. But we really need to look about how that policy that no one talks about, that no one even talks about or knows about, but how that is impacting our girls and how it's criminalizing our girls and leading to Pushout. And so what we're doing right now is looking at what those policies are around the states, who has them, what do they look like, and then how it is that we engage with our districts and our localities to actually push that those policies have reform, or even think about how they're impacting our girls. Oftentimes we don't even think about policies that exist, right? We think about dress code. We think about things that Monique was talking about in her book, were around dress code. We're talking about sexual harassment, but sometimes we don't even think about what's in penal, like what is actually in like the code of conduct in our schools. What is it saying? And quite honestly, if it says in there that a child can be pulled into administration and police can come because of annoying behavior, that's a huge issue that we've got to look at, and we've got to know what that is and where that is. And so we're doing some policy mapping and kind of looking at what that looks like for states, and I'm sure we'll be offering some type of resource through the organization at some point, so we can actually help more people know what those policies are and how we can work to push those in a direction to help our girls. So I'll turn it back over.
Yeah, thank you. I think what has been, profoundly helpful in this conversation has been the interrogation around the dress codes and the codes of conduct that I have seen materialize in different cities as a function of growing interest in how there are actual policies beyond practices that reflect the prevailing consciousness that assumes that the proper way to respond to negative student behavior is through punishment. The use of the term annoying in response to girls, we hear over and over again our girls are called annoying or disruptive in ways that most people reflect dissent, and this way in which in some ways these are just manifestations of their own thinking, critical thinking, in that result in them being in contact with some disciplinary figure in school. I am very pleased that there have been a number of school districts around the country that have been revising their codes of conduct, not just to include restorative practices and broad language, that benefit all students, but that have a particular lens around how to interrupt and develop codes of conduct that will not disproportionately impact and negatively impact girls of color. So conversations, actually, so a series, a new toolkit was released last week from the National Women's Law Center called Let Her Learn, that is a good place for parents and other concerned community adults who want to get involved in these conversations on behalf of their children or children in their lives, to engage in conversations about, or at the school level, about the practices that might disproportionately impact girls of color, Black girls in particular, but an interrogation around the codes of conduct, an interrogation around how we are perceiving annoying behavior and how we can deeply challenge ourselves, for those of us who are educators, not to teach with ego, but to teach with love and a centering of the student learning, is a critical practice, and one that we are developing and learning as we move forward in our conversations with girls. And so again, I started this by saying that we are part of a learning community, and that what we're sharing with you today is really a series of our preliminary observations about how we begin to have this conversation. I hope that those who are in conversation with us and who pose questions to us understand that I have often said it's important for us to think about this not as the end of a conversation because we've identified it as an issue, but to recognize that over the next 5 years at least, we should be thinking about a much more robust engagement and series of innovative practices that can help us also reflect on what is working and what can work with our girls who are impacted by criminalization. I think that much of what we have shared with you today, though we've anchored this work in the practices and in the engagement with girls who are, as I described before, most at risk of school pushout or who have multiple experiences with this phenomenon, these are things that can transfer and translate into a classroom affecting all kids. That if we really think about how we build out robust learning spaces and how we construct climate in schools that prioritize healing and learning rather than discipline and punishment, then we're able to really address those who are also dealing with transgenerational trauma and multi-systems involvement. So I'm gonna turn it over to you, Maisie, to lead us in our Q&A portion.
Thank you, Monique and Aishatu, for sharing your insights. I certainly, before we turn over to questions, I do want to reflect back something that I will then pose as a question to you, Monique, which is really about, you had talked about the structure and the fundamental need for trust and relationship building. And so when you think, so you've talked a lot about the girls and what it takes to do that between the girls and the adults. And I think, as many of us know, the cracks in the pavement, though, are often the adults as well. And what you mentioned in some of your observations, the cultural illiteracy, the need to see it as a relationship rather than a transaction of getting people through. So what in your work, what have you learned, and what can you offer to folks who are the adults in the process, who are coming from different systems, who all have to learn a new language that is not ego-based, that is empathic and is focused on healing? What does it take among the adults to do this work?
Thank you for that question. We have observed that probably one of the most important aspects of this is adult self-care. that when well people are engaged in conversations with young people, that they're able to transfer that wellness in a way that people who are unwell transfer their unwellness. And so I think it's really important for us to think about strategies and opportunities to invest in teaching and teachers differently, especially since they are the front line working with our young people, many of our young people who are in crisis. I also think that, there are a series of conversations that adults can have with other adults as they begin school years or school semesters about the development of alternatives in their spaces, about the relationships that they have with their administrators, about the ways in which their communication styles might be reflective of other forms of oppression that then gets transferred to the young people that they are working with. The inequities that we see structurally in districts, certainly plays out in the classroom. As much as there might be caring adults who try not to bring those tensions into the space of learning, young people, we don't give them enough credit for their interpretive reproduction of our learning spaces. And so they receive energy and understand energy, and our inability to recognize that, I think, does us a disservice. And so one of the things that I think is most important as we think about building out safe spaces, learning spaces for young people, particularly girls of color, is a recognition that is a basic transparency in how we heal together and how we learn. The adults that interact with the girls in our pilot initiative are adults that engage in regular practices and conversations around healing. And those strategies are shared with young people. There is a space in the classroom that's called the Peace Place that is a sort of neutral zone where young people can engage in practices of healing. And the adults themselves, can also, bring to an extent a piece of, their whole self and practice to the classroom as well. And these are things that we see in rigorous, high performing schools take place all the time, where, there are spaces, there are activities that people are engaged in together. There's a critical community of questioning and engagement that supports this kind of engagement. Fundamentally, though, I think it's really important that the adults engage in a space where they recognize the promise of all children. Unfortunately, I have had conversations with adults in schools who do not recognize the promise of all children, that they recognize the promise of some children. And so it's really important for us to challenge our own assumptions and how that plays out in our behaviors, and to have regular discussions, check-ins, and checkpoints around involvement and an uplifting of this idea and this consciousness.
Thank you. And we are going to pivot to our listeners soon. And I have one last question to throw out to both Aishatu and yourself, really about just also the kind of the gap, if you will, between policy and practice. So as Aishatu was talking about mapping all the different policies that are coming down at the state level, which is going to be more and more important, obviously, in this coming year, so understanding what states are doing and then how it actually translates into real life. And the fact that you're both reconstructing real life and then also mapping these policies, what are your, in the context of this work, what are your plans for sort of really taking the what you're learning from the practice and influencing policy and or translating policy, whether it's sound policy or not so sound policy, into, how are you going to mitigate maybe very harmful policies in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, that's a tougher question. And I think that's an open inquiry at the moment, I think, for all of us who are in this learning community, around how we bridge the gap between the research, the practice, and the policies that we know to be less effective based upon the research and practice. And I think, what's really, I think, an opportunity for us in this work is that so much of our conversations around policy have been about the destructive components of punitive discipline, that we, part of the reason why the emphasis for our pilot initiative is number one, a participatory project that includes the girls as researchers with us in this space, but also, with our other partners, is that much of our policy doesn't reflect what we know to work in our innovation and practice. And so part of what we have to do is to, again, have a more robust investment in that innovation so that we can gather and collect what we know to be successful practices to then translate over into the development of new policies that reflect that. We've seen that take place in some areas where, California, for example, was able to introduce legislation around willful defiance, or not, using it as a basis for suspension and expulsion in some spaces, because we know that willful defiance is deeply problematic as a framework, and certainly problematic as the justification for removing children from school, given its highly subjective nature. But there's more that we could do in terms of thinking about what then needs to be in place in the ed codes at our state and local levels. What kinds of conversations should we be having with our local boards of education that can then facilitate a better match in credit recovery among kids who have been out of school for a while, who are trying to repair their relationship with schools? These are all things that negatively, that are essentially harmful to young people who are trying to get back on track. And yet we have not done a great job of trying to get those in line with what our intentions might be around recovering relationships and repairing relationships between girls and schools. And so I think, as we start to name these issues and we start to think about this work, I think it's also going to be really important for organizers in the education space to begin to work with the scholars and the other advocates in this work, so that the things that we're having conversations about and the things that we're talking about promoting with under any administration and in every state and local community are ultimately anchoring the well-being of our young people, and not any specific economic interests of bodies that want to engage in this conversation.
Well, thank you so much. And I know that I'm supposed to now pass it off to Mariana Islam from our Schott Foundation team to field questions that have come through the chat and or Twitter. And I'll more or less be signing off, but I certainly want to thank both Aishatu and you, Dr. Morris, for sharing everything. So now everyone else gets to engage you. Mariana?
Great, thank you so much. So we have been having lively conversations on Twitter and in our chat feature. We encourage you to continue to tweet your thoughts and questions to us. Meanwhile, we are also tweeting out information and resources that were mentioned so far in this webinar. So the first question I have for Dr. Morris is, how do you address critics, many of whom probably do not follow the research on intersectionality, who think a focus on intersectionality takes something away from the general population? So for instance, a focus on girls of color takes away any focus on girls as a whole, or a focus on girls takes away a focus from boys. How would you respond to critics?
So one of the things that's interesting is I don't spend a lot of time responding to critics because I choose to place most of my emphasis on advancing the robust nature of the work that I'm focused on. But I do think it's an important question around those who feel that investing in one population is to the detriment of another. Anyone who can challenge the framework around intersectionality doesn't understand what intersectionality is, is what I have to say there. Because, when Kimberly Crenshaw, created this term to capture the intentional way to reject a single issue axis as a way to move forward, she was not saying that the other investments are invalid. What she was saying was that when we engage in an acknowledgement of multiple identities and advance a structure and conversation that is its most inclusive, that we are able to increase and improve our strategy overall. So the focus on Black girls, the focus on girls of color, the focus on girls is not to say that the investment in boys was a bad thing. I consistently say that the investment in boys was a necessary investment, that it was important to the conversation, and in many ways, laid a platform and foundation for conversations to happen about other identities. That said, an investment only in boys to the exclusion of girls is insufficient. That the investment only in girls to the exclusion of boys is insufficient. That we have to think about the structures that are impacting all of our children in unique ways, because our responses, if we're going to move in the direction that adequately responds, and not even just adequacy, not even in terms of being adequate, but that robustly responds to the needs of our children in crisis, then we have to acknowledge their multiple identities, and then we have to develop structures and practices and interventions that are responsive to those things. We can't get there unless we acknowledge that these identities exist. And if we can't get there unless we acknowledge the different ways in which they are experiencing these phenomena are playing out in their lives. And so, the way in which we have moved with those is often to say those who are experiencing something or condition to a greater extent than their peers can teach us so much about what needs to improve overall. And when we center those who are most marginalized or most harmed by a condition, then we're able to use their experiences to inform our practices overall. Everything that we do in response to the conditions of Black girls, everything that we do in response to the conditions of girls of color is going to positively benefit everyone else. Because ultimately, when we're talking about structures of developing healing-informed schools, when we're talking about building out curriculum that acknowledges historical trauma and helps to provide opportunities for young people to bring themselves, their whole selves, to their learning practice, these are practices that will help everyone be stronger and not center only those who respond well to the existing sets and structures that are in place and currently causing harm in other spaces. So ultimately, I just reject the idea that investing in one group is to the complete detriment of another. I do think it's important to engage in an intersectional framework, because in that way, we're able to build a much more robust response to the larger group.
Great. So we got a few questions about what EMERGE stands for, so the acronym EMERGE, and if you could also share some tools and strategies that were used by EMERGE staff to facilitate the process of building trust with the young girls you work with.
Yeah, so EMERGE stands for Educating, Mentoring, Empowering, and Reaffirming Our Girls for Excellence. And again, it's a partnership with the Mentoring Center, the National Black Women's Justice Institute, and our institutional partners of Laney Community College and Alameda County's Office of Education. Also doing some work in partnership with the Oakland Unified School District and several other community agencies and partners who work with us regularly and our girls regularly in and out of the classroom. What our staff did to build trust, number one, we recognize that it takes about 2 weeks to build a community in the classroom with this particular group, and that trust is not something that is established after that 2 weeks, but that it's a constant process. Again, most of our girls have had contact with the juvenile legal system or are somehow engaging in a response to several conditions and structures of oppression. And so building trust for our girls means responding to them and their needs, providing an opportunity for them to, what the girls refer to as not hiding themselves, right? Bringing themselves to the classroom. And also, really creating and using the classroom through spoken word, through dance, through the arts, really, to present themselves and their critical ideas about learning as a part of this process. One of the new things that we've learned is necessary for us to do to establish trust is to have a 3-day retreat with the girls, where we spend time having conversations with them, where they participate in the articulation of their own affirmations, the creation of their own affirmations, what they'd like to do with themselves and in the development of their own educational work plans. The important thing is that, you know, and one of our challenges, our biggest challenges around building trust with the girls has been other adults. So back to Maisie's question about the ways in which adults can model a healthy space around working with the girls or be disruptive in that process. Where adults who may be representative from one or more of the systems may come in to engage with the girls and you know, sort of challenge their capacity to completely heal has been a challenge. But I think what is most important in the development of the trust has been to do a couple of things very early on. Number one, to meet with the girls and the parents through an orientation process where there is an opportunity for one-on-one engagement between the staff and the parents or the adult representative with the girls, so that there is a collective understanding about what the initiative is, what the pilot project is, and what we expect to be able to provide to the girls, and what the girls will be expected to do in return. We engage in regular practices that allow for the girls to come in and start the day with a quote and a meditation and or discussion of a daily quote that centers their learning as a part of their critical practice of being engaged in this social justice movement. So that, again, recognizing that many of these girls are coming from multiple structures of oppression and have been navigating transgenerational trauma, starting the day with a recognition that their education is a part of their resistance to this oppression has been an important way to build trust and a framework around their learning that I think makes them build connections with folks that are important. And one of the most important things is that we have staff that reflect many of the conditions or have lived many of the conditions that our girls are experiencing. Those who lead workshops, those who are regularly engaged with the girls are not people who are not from their community or from similar communities. These are folks who understand poverty to prison frameworks. These are folks who understand and have lived, you know, moving through multiple systems. These are folks who have themselves been in and out of various schools and conditions, so that the girls feel an energy with these girls, a connection with these women, rather, who are able to engage with them and share lessons of survival and resistance. And Aishatu, I'm sure you have other thoughts about that.
Yeah, I did. The couple things that I wanted to add to that is I think one of the things that the adults in Emerge do and do very well is they allow the girls to be full humans, to be their full selves. I think what often happens in a lot of spaces that we enter is we have to enter as a certain part of ourselves. We have to show up at school every day ready to learn. But the fact is that especially the population at Emerge is they're not going to show up every single day ready to learn, ready to answer the questions. They're going to be happy, sad, angry, distraught. You know, I don't know my feeling, you know, all those things. And I think what the teachers in Emerge do very well is allow those, encourage it, and then allow those and all those emotions to come in, recognize them, and then also create ways in which how we work past that and how we continue to learn and thrive with all of those emotions, because those emotions don't go away through life, right? Like that's what we live with every day. And so one of the great things that the Emerge teachers have done is allowed space in the peace place and openly to be able to be your full self in that space. And I think the other thing I would add is that the accountability piece, which Monique's touched on really quickly, but in a way in which they build trust is the idea that I'm going to love you through it. I'm going to love you here, and I'm going to hold you accountable for doing what you expect you to be doing and what we expect you to be doing. And I think that piece, which often, especially in this population of girls, is a piece that is easily let go. In the accountability, we often say, well, they've had this and this happen to them. We can't expect them to read. Right. And I think that is such a detrimental thing that happens often in a lot of spaces, and in Emerge, it's unacceptable. You know, you come in and you had the worst night last night. You slept at the park last night. Whatever it was, you're going to come in, we're going to talk about it. And maybe your reading for that day is something in relation to that. Right? Maybe you're not something in relation to what you're experiencing, but we're still going to hold you accountable for whatever it is we're supposed to be doing here while you experience all of these things and you experience life. And I think that's a huge way in which trust has been built at Emerge to the adults.
I see that we're close to our end. There are a lot of questions, and specifically questions around teacher preparation, curriculum and coursework to really address the importance of addressing biases. And I'm hoping we can continue that conversation on Twitter. So we are about time. And in closing, I just want to thank our expert panel of presenters today, Dr. Monique Morris, Aishatu Yusuf, and Schott's own Macy Chin. On behalf of all of us, we want to thank everyone for joining this call. We've had great turnout, and know that this webinar will be available to those of you who weren't able to make it today. It will be on our Schott Foundation YouTube page. To continue this conversation, again, we invite you to join Schott's National Opportunities to Learn Network at www.schottfoundation.org, and to also follow us on Twitter again at SchottFound. And we've posted important links to resources, including to the National Black Women's Justice Institute page, where you'll find information referenced on this webinar. And we encourage you to stay tuned and join us again for the next edition of our 25th anniversary webinar series, which is coming in March. So thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.